for this project, I'm going to be working with the following tools. I'm going to be making the pattern first. So I have my pattern paper, my long ruler, set square, my marker pen, pencil, a tape measure, some pins, as well as my fabric scissors for now. I'm going to go ahead and take the following measurements, and these are the measurements you will need to create the pattern specifically for the skirt, and I've listed them here on the screen. You should make sure to use yours or that of your client to achieve the best result. So I'm going to go ahead and create my skirt front pattern, and I'm starting here by drawing a horizontal line that's going to become my waistline. This doesn't have to be too long, depending on the size that you are working with. So once I've drawn that straight horizontal line here, I'm just going down to mark the front length of my skirt. The back is going to be a little bit longer, so just keep that in mind. Once I've marked that length, I'm just going in to square it across like so I have the hem of the front of my skirt. So next thing I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be marking the vertical distance from my waist to my hip line. Because the skirt is a little bit on the high-waisted side, the difference is, or the distance is 10 inches for me. So the distance from my waistline to my hip line is 10 inches, and I'm just squaring that across like so. Next up, I'm marking 11 inches down from that hip line, which is around where my knee would be. So if you measure yourself or your clients, just go ahead and use your desired measurements. So next up, I'm going to divide my waistline by 4 and add 1 inch, which is going to be taking away through that waist that I'll be adding later on. And then I'm dividing my hip line by 4 and marking it on the hip point. And then I divided my around knee measurement by 4 and I'm marking that on this point like so. For the skirt width, I decided to work with 23 inches because I didn't want something that was going to make the base too wide and I won't be able to cut it on the fabric. So once we've marked all those points, I'm just going in here to connect them together using the curved end of my pattern master, especially for the hip area and then around the knee area, because I don't just want a point in the angles that it extends outwards towards the hem. So that area I make sure it's curved and then I connect it back to the hem point. So now that we have the main skirt front sort of done, I'm going to go in and add my dart and shape the waist before going ahead to create the fishtail on the back. So first up, I'm going to go ahead and add my front waist dart, and I'm going to be measuring the midpoint, which is 4 inch, and mark outwards on another 1 inch, and the middle point of that sort of 1 additional inch that we added to the waistline. And I'm going to be drawing a vertical line that is 13 centimeters or about 5 inches long. This line cannot be longer than your hip line, else you're going to lose some of that measurement. So I'm just going ahead to draw in the dart shape, connecting the sides to that dart point like so. And after this is done, the next thing I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be marking 1/2 inch above the side edge of the waist on this side, and then I'm going to be curving it back into the waistline. This just allows the waist of the skirt to sit a lot nicer when you have it on. It's something I've noticed because I've done skirts with straight waist and skirt with curved waist lines like these, and I just find that this just sits a lot nicer in my opinion. So I'd like to go ahead and double check that my waistline still fits me after adding my shape and my darts, and once I'm happy with that, I can go ahead and add my 1 centimeter or 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around, depending on which you want to work with. So for this particular project, I'm using 1 centimeter and I'm just using my pattern master to mark it all the way around except on the center front because I want to cut this piece on a fold. On the hem, I'm adding a 2 centimeter hem allowance, so in case I decide to fold this up later on, I have a little bit of leeway. Next up, I'm just adding my grain line so I know the direction that I need to cut this pattern on, what my center front is, and that I'm cutting it on a fold. So this is what my front pattern looks like. It is just one piece, sort of half of the front. I just need to cut one piece, and the edge of the front hem was where I had a little bit of confusion. For now, I pointed it downwards, so when it's folded back up into the skirt on the side, it sort of merges. And then I went ahead to cut out my pattern piece, as this is what the front of my skirt looks like. So once you're happy with that, you're free to go ahead and trace that front onto another pattern paper for your back and just change some details so it works as the back of the skirt. So the first thing you need to do is, you see that center back seam there? I like to curve my center back in by 1 centimeter or half an inch, because the curve on your back is not straight, so when it's curved in like that, it prevents your zip from bulging. And then my back dart is shorter by 1 inch compared to my front. Everything else is relatively the same, so the hip, the knee is the same, the side is the same, but the part that is going to be different is going to be the center back edge on the bottom. Using a pencil first, I like to go ahead and draw in my fishtail shape on this back edge like so, and I curve it outwards in such a direction that it is longer than your side seam. So then I connect the bottom hem together from the side all the way to the center back, and I like to use pencil first because the shape is something that you can play around with, but in order to have that really fishtail shape at the center back, you need to ensure that the side is a little bit shorter than the center. So once you're happy with that, you can go ahead and use a more permanent form of drawing, such as a pen or a marker or like a thicker pencil, and then just define your lines. Once that is all done, you can go ahead and add your 1 centimeter seam allowance, especially along the center back edge, which is where your zip is going to sit. So I'm just going in here to draw my back hemline like so, connecting it to the side edge or the side seam. And this I like to have a little bit straight on the side and then curve in the middle area, so it just forms a really nice shape when we cut this onto fabric. So this is what my back pattern looks like. I'm just going to go ahead and cut out my skirt back pattern along the side. Remember, we added seam allowance to the side of the front, and because we traced the front onto to create this back, onto fresh pattern paper to create this back, we don't need to add seam allowance along the waist, along the side, and along the hem of your back. So this is my back skirt pattern. I indicated where my seam allowances are. This is what the shape of the hemline looks like, and the shape of the sort of center back area, which actually looks like the tail of a fish. I think that's why it's called like fishtail or mermaid skirt. So now that we've done our back, we know that we're good to go to cut this onto fabric to see how it fits and sits on the body. We have our front on top of the back, and you can see the difference in terms of shape, especially around the hem of the skirt. The back is a lot longer than the front, and the side seam of the front and the back, they have to meet. For the edge of the hem, I decided to keep them both pointy. I just hope this won't give me a problem later on when I have to finish off the hem. But the waist, the hip, everything else is relatively the same for the front and the back. So now we're going to go ahead into the actual pattern testing to check for errors, and I'm using this lovely green Ankara fabric. You would need about 5 meters of fabric to sew this skirt because of the wideness of the tail at the back. I also have an invisible tape that is about 10 inches long and 1 meter of black lining for the inside of the skirt. So I'm just going ahead and pin down my pattern. I'm cutting my front on a fold, so I have one piece for my front skirt, and once I'm done cutting this front out, I'm going to go ahead and cut my back as well as my lining panels. Don't forget to cut your notches, especially for the dart, for the hip, and for the knee sort of point, because it has to match. The hip line and the knees have to match on the front and the back. So these are all of my pieces cut out and ready to go. I have my front, I have my 2 back pieces, one for the left and one for the right. I also have my lining pieces here. For my lining, I decided to cut it just to about where the knee stops. You have the freedom to cut yours longer, but because this is more like a sample or a test, I didn't just want to go ahead to commit to a full piece lining just yet. So once I have all of my pieces cut out, we're ready to sew. The first thing I like to do when it comes to making skirts or anything that has darts is I like to just get the darts sewn and out of the way. So I'm just going in here to mark my darts from my pattern paper onto my fabric, and this is the wrong side of my fabric. Using a chalk, I'm going to mark where my dart point is on both sides of my front panel here. So once we've marked that point with the chalk, we can just align the notched edges of the darts, pull it together like so, and then use 1 or 2 pins to just hold this folded dart in place until we're ready to actually stitch it together. So I'm going to go ahead and pin the other side of the front, ensuring that the dart point aligns with the middle of the dart along the waist. Once I've added my pins, I know I'm ready to take this in my machine to actually stitch it up in place. So this I will do for my front, this I will do for my back, and for my lining pieces as well. So I'm going to be sewing using a normal straight stitch on my domestic machine because that's what I'll be working with today. And I find that machine has served me really well over the last couple of years. Don't forget to do your back stitch at the beginning and at the end. And if you find that when you sew a dart it's difficult to finish off at the end of the dart, you can always run out some thread and tie 1 or 2 knots to secure your dart. So this is what my front piece is looking like. I went ahead to press my darts nice and flat so they point to the side seam. And the beautiful thing about Ankara fabric, cotton, woven fabrics is it's a lot easier to sew and looks really beautiful when you press it. So I've went ahead to sew my back darts as well on the left and on the right hand side, and this is what they're looking like, pointing towards the center back of the skirt. Next up, I'm going to go ahead and fix my invisible zip into the center back of my skirt, and I like to open up the zip like so, put right sides together of my zip to the right side of the skirt, starting with this side that is closer to the left hand of the screen. I just put 1 or 2 pins, and then I take this to my machine and I stitch up one side at a time. I don't like to get confused, so I just find doing this a lot easier. So I'm just going to go ahead and change my footer to my invisible zip footer, which is a lot narrower and lets the needle sort of stay closer to the zip teeth. I've rotated the needle to the right hand side so it passes through. So I have a more detailed tutorial on how to fix invisible zips. I'm going to put that somewhere on the screen and link it down below for anyone who hasn't seen it yet. But I find that unrolling the zip a little bit and sewing closer to the zip teeth generally gives you better results. So once I've done that side, I'm going to go ahead and fix the other side of the zip to the other side of the skirt, putting right sides together, and just put 1 or 2 pins so this thing doesn't move around when you travel from the table to your sewing station. So I'm just going in to add 1 more pin. I'm going to take this to my machine and I'm going to be sewing with my zip footer using a normal straight stitch from the top all the way to the bottom. Once you're happy with the outcome of your zip, you can go ahead and check to see that it looks good on the front. And the next thing you need to do is to join the center back seam underneath the zip together. So I find that putting the zip first before joining the seam is a lot easier to do, especially with invisible zips. So now I'm going to take this to my machine and I'm going to join up that center back seam starting from the bottom, still using that my zip footer with the narrow sort of metal foot, and work my way all the way to the top on a 1 centimeter seam allowance until I get to the bottom of that zip, and sew up until the point that the stitch of me joining the zip to the back end, so there is no hole showing on the back of this garment. So this is what the skirt looks like from behind. I just put it down on the floor just to show you what the shape of the fishtail at the bottom. It looks like how it sort of sits and how it behaves, and I'm actually very happy with the length and the curve especially. After this, I'm going to go ahead and join my front panel to my back along the side seams. I enjoy just pinning seams together first, but if you're a whole lot more comfortable sewing straight away, you can just pick this piece up together and go onto your machine and just sew straight away. So I like to put a pin at the notched point, so at the hip, around the knee, on the hem. This just prevents a situation whereby you sew and you get to the bottom and you realize that the seams do not match and you have excess on one side that you really can't get rid of. So once I've done my left hand side, I'm going to go ahead and add 1 or 2 pins on the other side, and then I'm going to take this to my machine and I'm going to be joining up both side seams using a 1 centimeter seam allowance on my trusty old Baroda domestic machine. So now I'm just starting from the beginning, working my way all the way down. Don't forget to do your reverse or back stitch at the beginning and at the end to secure your seam. Since this is a relatively stable fabric, you don't need to adjust the tension in any special way. It just would sew as good as usual. So for the lining, I went ahead to stitch up my darts on the front and on the back as well, like we did with the main outer skirt. And then I'm going to go ahead to sew up the side seam so we can join the lining onto the main skirt along the waistline. So now I'm just sewing using my normal footer on a 1 centimeter seam allowance, using a normal straight stitch, and remembering to do my back stitch at the beginning and at the end. So I'm going to go ahead and join my lining onto my skirt along the waistline because I'm not going to have a waistband, and this is how I'm going to finish off the waistline of the skirt. So I've pinned together that point, side seams, and I'm working my way to the center back. So for the center back, you want to sandwich your zip in between the lining and the main skirt so that finishes up the top back of your skirt. So I'm doing this end like so, and then I'm going to fold out the other end and pin the lining over the zip in such a way that when you stitch this up, it looks even nice and neat on the inside of the garment. So starting from one side, we're going to work our way from this bottom end of this zip on the center back, work our way up, and then when we get to this top edge of this back side, we're going to leave the needle in, lift the footer and turn towards the waistline, drop your footer back down, and then continue sewing. So we're going to sew all the way around on a 1 centimeter seam allowance until we get to the other side of the back, and when we get there, we drop the needle in, lift our footer as per usual, drop the footer again, and sew until you get to the bottom edge, until you literally cannot sew any further, honestly. So when you're done doing that, I'm just going in to cut the edges of my top back. So when I turn this piece inside out, it allows me to reveal my zip nicely. But first, I like to top stitch the lining to the seam allowance along the waist, because that helps to keep the lining on the inside of the garment. So if you don't have any facing, if you don't have any waistbands, this is something that you should really consider doing if you're finishing off your waistline with just your lining. So I'm just top stitching here on about 0.2 or 0.3 centimeter seam, really close to the edge, and you're sewing up the lining to the seam allowance on the inside of your skirt. I like to sew from center back dart to center back dart, so it just really pulls the lining on the inside, and this is what it looks like. It looks really nice and really neat, and it's something I like to do if I'm not using facing or waistbands. So now that we have this part of the waist and the zip tidied and tucked away, I'm going to turn the skirt inside out so I can finish up the center back area around the bottom of the lining. So when you turn it inside out, this is what it should look on the inside of the garment. I'm going to join together this sort of open area that looks like a slit on the skirt lining. So I'm just pinning together right sides together like this, and then I'm going to pull this upwards like so I can pin together or join together that center back opening up until the point that we have our zip on the main skirt. So I'm going to be sewing this particular area up on a 1 centimeter seam allowance using a normal straight stitch. When I get to the very edge where the zip is, I remember to do my back stitch, so that just secures this seam nice and neatly. So I'm just going to turn this and reveal the right side, or the good side of the garment, so you see what it finishes off like on the inside, and that just looks really nice and really tidy, and I'm happy with it. So this is what the waistband looks like. Make sure to give it a good old press to relax all of your seams, and just ensure that that zip actually aligns on the skirt top back, because whenever it doesn't, something inside of me just dies slowly. So next up, I'm just going in to overlock all my visible seams on my lining, on my main skirt. So those are my side seams, my center back seams, as well as my hems. You have the freedom to fold the hem of your lining as well if you want to do that after overlocking it, and you also have the freedom to fold the hem of your actual skirt if you want to, just to ensure that it looks really nice and tidy. But because it's a sample, I'm just going to end that overlocking the hem of the skirt for now. This is what the finished skirt looks like. It turned out a lot nicer than I imagined, and I'm so happy about that. Imagine just adding a bodice to this skirt and it to become a really lovely evening formal dress silhouette. But I hope you guys enjoyed watching this video all the same. Please let me know down below. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and I will see you guys in my next one. Bye.